April 1945. The Arizona desert looked like another planet. The horizon shimmered under a white sun that stripped color from everything sky, sand, and human skin alike. When the transport truck shuddered to a halt at Camp Florence, the silence was almost holy. Then the tailgate slammed down, and 12 women climbed out into the blinding light, their shadows crisp against the dust. 22-year-old Greta Hoffman stumbled last. Her wrists still bore the dark. Angry marks of rope burns from the journey. Every breath felt like breathing through hot cloth. The air itself seemed to judge her enemy. Captive, defeated. Her grandmother's final command echoed like a curse in her mind. Die with honor. Don't let them break you. That sentence had become a kind of heartbeat through months of retreat and capture. She'd repeated it to herself, while Allied soldiers herded them through barbed wire checkpoints. While the rumors grew darker, Americans who carved swastikas into prisoners' faces, who starved them and made them crawl. She believed every word. Now, as her boots touched American soil for the first time, Greta was certain she was walking into hell. The first surprise came immediately. The figure approaching across the compound wore a spotless U.S. Army uniform, Lieutenant, bars polished, clipboard in hand. But what made Greta blink wasn't the authority. It was the woman's face. Japanese, American. The features of an enemy inside the uniform of the victor. The woman stopped 3 paces away. Expression, calm as carved granite. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka," she said in flawless German. "Welcome to Camp Florence. Follow me for processing. No shouting. No dogs. No hands raised to strike." Greta froze. The precision of the German. The absence of cruelty, it had to be theater. Propaganda. They were being softened before punishment began. Processing took an hour. Names. Service numbers. Occupations. Medical checks. The barracks smelled of pine sap and desert dust. Greta touched the thin mattress on her assigned cot, the first actual bed she'd seen in weeks, and recoiled as if it might vanish. A bar of ivory soap sat neatly on the pillow, almost luminous against the rough wool blanket. She turned it over in her palm, waiting for it to crumble into ash. When the dinner bell rang, fear gathered tight in her throat. The women marched to the mess hall, expecting watery gruel or moldy bread. Instead, the air hit them with a scent so rich it made their knees weak roast beef, thick and pink in the center. Butter melting on mashed potatoes. A roll that steamed when torn open. Canned peaches glistening like amber. Greta could only stare at the tin tray. Her stomach twisted in hunger and suspicion. "This is American prison food," she whispered, half to herself. Beside her, Liesel Weber, 38, and already hardened into suspicion, slapped the fork from Greta's hand. "Don't touch it," she hissed. "It's poisoned. They want us compliant. Fatten us before the real punishment." The clang of the fork echoed in the hall. Greta's pulse thudded in her ears. It made sense. Everything she'd been told said Americans were savages. You didn't feed enemies like this unless you were preparing them for something worse. Then Lieutenant Tanaka appeared again. She set down her own tray, identical, down to the last green bean, and calmly cut into her meat. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and steady. Geneva Convention, Article 26. Prisoners of war receive the same rations as the captor nation's troops. The Red Cross posts the reports if you wish to read them. And with that, she took a bite. The room went still. Even Liesel faltered. Greta's hand trembled as she lifted the fork again. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the possibility that Tanaka was lying, or the possibility that she wasn't. She took a cautious bite. Warm, savory, real. In that instant, Something inside Greta cracked open. If they had lied about this, about the enemy's barbarity, about the starvation, about who was human and who was not, then what else had been a lie? That night, long after lights out, Greta reached into her sleeve and pulled out the small piece of beef she'd hidden like contraband. She tasted it again in the dark. It no longer felt like food. It felt like betrayal. And yet, it was the first time in years she'd eaten without fear. She began to cry quietly, tears hot against the cold meat. Outside, the desert stretched in endless silence. The same silence that had greeted her when she arrived. But now, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like the world holding its breath, waiting to see who she would become next. To understand what Greta stumbled into that April, we need to step back far beyond the fences of Camp Florence, into the broader machinery of a world at war. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, it suddenly faced a new logistical dilemma. What to do with the tide of captured Axis soldiers flooding in from Europe and North Africa? By 1945, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across the continental United States. Camp Florence, deep in the Arizona desert, was one of the largest of them all, a sprawling compound of wooden barracks, barbed wire, and sunburned dust built to hold up to 13 null prisoners. To the locals, it looked like a mirage, a miniature town ringed by fences. To the U.S. military, it was both a humane holding center and a quiet demonstration to the world. America follows the law, even when its enemies don't. The law in question was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. It required the detaining power to feed, house, and treat prisoners as favorably as the troops of the government who captured them. That meant rations equivalent to those served to U.S. soldiers, the right to medical care, letters, religious observance, and protection from violence or humiliation. In practice, Camp Florence followed these articles to the letter. The Red Cross inspected it regularly. The camp's food came straight from the Army Quartermaster Corps, which meant roast beef and buttered potatoes weren't kindness, they were compliance. This was not mercy as Greta's grandmother would have defined it. It was law, and that distinction would come to matter more than Greta could imagine. Yet for all the structure, Camp Florence was born of contradictions. It stood on land, once inhabited by the O'odham and Apache peoples dispossessed by earlier waves of conquest. It was run by soldiers fighting for democracy, while segregation persisted at home. And among those enforcing the Geneva Convention were Americans who themselves had been denied its spirit. Japanese Americans like Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka. Sarah's presence was no historical anomaly. Thousands of Nisei, the American-born children of Japanese immigrants, served in the U.S. military during World War II. Even as their own families were forced into internment camps behind barbed wire. Many served in the 100th Infantry Battalion or the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team, units that became some of the most decorated in U.S. history. Others, like Sarah, joined the Military Intelligence Service, translating documents, interrogating prisoners, or working in administrative roles in camps like Florence. Imagine that paradox, wearing the uniform of a country that had labeled your family enemy aliens, enforcing international law for the benefit of Axis prisoners, while your parents ate government-issued rations behind fences in places like Manzanar and Poston. For Sarah Tanaka, law was no abstract principle. It was the fragile thread separating civilization from hypocrisy. Meanwhile, America's treatment of POWs was as much propaganda as principle. The U.S. wanted proof that it was different from its enemies. Reports of humane camps were deliberately leaked through the Red Cross to neutral nations. While photographs of German POWs working peacefully in cotton fields circulated in newspapers, each steak dinner served in Camp Florence was a silent message to the world. This is how democracy behaves. But there was also a practical reason. The U.S. needed labor. With millions of men overseas, fields and factories faced shortages. POWs became part of the wartime economy, picking cotton, cutting timber, repairing irrigation canals. Camp Florence's prisoners, including women like Greta, worked for 80 cents a day in camp script, redeemable at the canteen. The system turned enemies into a temporary workforce and proved strangely effective at keeping order. Compare this to what was happening on the other side of the world. In Europe, German forces had captured over 5 million Soviet soldiers, of whom more than half would die in captivity, starved, frozen, or executed. In the Pacific, Japanese camps reduced Allied POWs to skeletons through brutality and forced labor. The very concept of the Geneva Convention was ignored, mocked, or unknown. By contrast, American camps like Florence became moral laboratories. They revealed both the strength and the limits of law in war. Yes, prisoners were fed, clothed, and paid. But these camps also reflected the glaring contradictions of their creators. A black American soldier could serve guard duty over a German POW who, by law, received better meals and accommodations than he did. The irony was impossible to miss. And for Greta Hoffman, indoctrinated from childhood to believe Americans were soulless barbarians, the structured civility of Florence was a kind of psychic assault. Every bar of soap, every warm meal, every polite order upended a lifetime of propaganda. Yet the reverse was also true. For Lieutenant Tanaka, every act of restraint was an act of rebellion against hatred, against hypocrisy, against the part of herself that still burned with grief for a brother who had died at Anzio, proving his loyalty to a country that never trusted him. In that collision between Greta's indoctrinated fear and Sarah's disciplined morality, Camp Florence became more than a POW camp. It became a crucible for questions that still echo in every war since. Can law humanize conflict? Can mercy survive the memory of atrocity? And when the war is over, what does it mean to be right? At the edges of the camp, the desert whispered its ancient indifference. It had seen civilizations rise and fall under its sun, each convinced of its own righteousness. But inside those fences, amid the smell of soap and roast beef, 2 women, 1 German, 1 Japanese American were about to test whether the rule of law could create something even rarer than victory. Something like understanding. The days at Camp Florence began the same way every morning trumpet at dawn. Desert air still cool enough to sting the lungs. The horizon etched in a pale pink glow that lasted only minutes before the sun erased it. For Greta Hoffman, routine was supposed to mean punishment. But here, the routines only deepened her confusion. She woke in a barracks that smelled of pine and soap, not fear. The guards called, roll in steady voices, not barks. When she expected humiliation, she found precision. And that precision made her uneasy. Each day, Greta and the other women worked 8 hours in laundry detail, hauling wet uniforms from industrial washers to clotheslines stretched like white veins across the compound. The heat turned their hands pink. The soap rawed their skin. But compared to the cold barracks of Europe, this was almost dangerously comfortable. At 80 cents per day in camp vouchers, Greta found herself with small luxuries she hadn't touched since before the war. Toothpaste, writing paper, a pencil. The canteen clerk, a board corporal named Miller, who barely looked up from his ledger, handed over her purchases without mockery or scorn. Next, he said, as if she were any other customer. It was the normalcy that felt cruelest. Across the compound, Anna Schultz, the youngest prisoner at 19, bought a pack of Lucky Strikes. She didn't smoke, But she kept the cigarettes in her pocket like a charm against unreality. If this is all a trick, she told Greta one night, it's the most beautiful one I've ever seen. And then there was Liesel Weber, always watching, her suspicion like a knife tucked beneath her tongue. A former SS auxiliary. Liesel wore discipline like armor. They feed us steak, she whispered one evening, so that when they take it away, it hurts more. Greta didn't argue. She didn't know what to believe anymore. What unsettled her most wasn't kindness, it was consistency. The Americans didn't waver. Orders were obeyed without screaming. Punishments were logged in triplicate. When a guard tried to skip a prisoner's dessert ration as a joke, Lieutenant Tanaka reassigned him to night watch for a month. When Liesel hoarded bread, Tanaka confiscated it quietly and wrote it down in a report. Greta watched her constantly now. Tanaka moved through the camp like a metronome, precise, calm, and untouchable. Greta knew from overheard gossip that Tanaka's parents were locked up somewhere in California, relocated for the duration of the war. Her brother had died in Italy, and yet, here she was, enforcing fairness toward Germans. It made no sense. No propaganda had prepared Greta for mercy backed by law. One evening, after work, Greta sat on her bunk staring at a blank sheet of paper. She wanted to write home but couldn't. What did one say to the family that had told her to die with honor? Dear mother, the enemy feeds me better than you ever could. The words turned to ash before they reached the page. Writer's block. The voice came from the doorway. Lieutenant Tanaka stood there, clipboard under her arm. Her German was immaculate, though slightly too formal, every consonant placed with care, as though each word carried risk. I don't know what to say, Greta admitted. If they're even alive. Tanaka's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. The truth is a good place to start. The truth, Greta snapped before she could stop herself, is that I eat steak while they starve. I sleep while bombs fall. How do I write that? The silence that followed felt heavy enough to bend the air. Then, Tanaka reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, cloth-bound book. Its cover was worn to softness, the gold lettering barely legible. English Deutsch Wörterbuch. She set it on the bunk beside Greta. If you want to understand the convention, start here. Tanaka said, it isn't mercy. It's law. There's a difference. Greta ran her fingers along the frayed spine. Why are you doing this? She asked. Treating us like we're human. Tanaka's expression didn't change, but her voice grew quieter. Because the law says you are. And the minute I stop following the law, I become what I'm fighting against. She turned to go, then added, write that your family would want to know you're alive. Start there. When she was gone, Greta opened the dictionary. The paper smelled of dust and ink. She whispered words aloud like prayers. Restraint, justice, mercy. Words she'd been taught to see as weakness. Within weeks, Greta had become the camp's unofficial English tutor. She taught Anna to say good morning and thank you in exchange for half her dessert. Even Liesel hovered at the back of the barracks sometimes, listening with her arms crossed. Why are you learning their language? Liesel demanded one night. Greta hesitated, then said quietly, because I want to understand what they're saying when they tell us why. There is no why. Liesel snapped, only waiting until we can go home. But Greta wasn't sure what home meant anymore. The Germany, she remembered the parades, the slogans. The certainty felt like a dream she'd awakened from. 3 months passed. Greta learned the English words for sunrise, coffee, and good morning. She said them each morning to Jimmy Mueller, the mess sergeant who always smiled when handing her breakfast. She learned to sleep without fear of footsteps in the dark, to eat without checking for poison. And just when the camp began to feel like a fragile kind of peace, a notice appeared on the bulletin board. Mandatory Assembly Camp Theater, 1,900 hours. No one knew what to expect. But when Greta saw Lieutenant Tanaka waiting at the front of the small room, her face carved from stone, she understood. The illusion was about to end. The war in Europe is over. Tanaka said in German, Germany has surrendered. What you will see tonight are official newsreels of the Allied liberation of concentration camps. You will watch all of it. Greta's hands began to shake. Beside her, Anna went pale. The lights dimmed, and the projector hummed to life. On the screen, images flickered, grainy black and white landscapes of horror. The skeletal bodies of Bergen-Belsen. The hollow-eyed survivors of Buchenwald. Bulldozers pushing corpses into trenches because there were too many to bury by hand. The world, Greta thought she understood her people, her duty. Her honor collapsed in 15 minutes of footage. She stumbled out of the theater, choking on bile. The desert air slamming into her lungs like a punishment. She dropped to her knees and vomited into the sand. She didn't hear Tanaka approach until a shadow fell across her. Did you know? Tanaka asked softly. Greta's voice broke. No. I was just a radio operator. I never saw, but you heard. Tanaka said. You sent coordinates, relayed messages, and never asked what they were for. I should have asked, Greta whispered. I should have wondered why there were so many trains. So many camps. Tanaka's voice was low but steady. My parents lost everything in San Francisco. My brother died in Italy fighting for a country that imprisoned his own family. I wanted to hate all of you. But the law said you were human, so I followed the law, even when I didn't feel it. She pointed back toward the theater. Restraint isn't kindness. It's the line between civilization and that. Greta looked at the sand, stained with her own sickness. For the first time, she didn't know which side of that line she stood on. After the newsreel, silence ruled Camp Florence. It wasn't an enforced silence, no orders, no curfews, but something heavier. The air itself seemed afraid to move. Conversations died halfway through. Even the desert wind held its breath. Greta barely spoke for days. She couldn't. The images from that screen had burned into her eyelids, the mounds of bodies, the eyes that stared without seeing, the bulldozers pushing death into ditches. Every night she saw them again, and every morning she woke gasping, her pillow damp with sweat. She stopped teaching English. She stopped writing letters. She worked when told, ate when watched, and existed somewhere between guilt and disbelief. Then one afternoon, a Red Cross courier arrived at the camp. The guard called her name during mail call Hoffman, Greta, and held out an envelope thin enough to see light through. Greta's fingers trembled as she took it. She hadn't expected mail. No one ever wrote back. Inside, the letter was short. Too short. She read it once, then again, until the meaning hit like a physical blow. Her mother and younger brother were dead killed in the February firebombing of Dresden. Her father was missing, presumed dead. Her grandmother, the woman who had told her to die with honor, had hanged herself in the garden shed 2 days after Germany's surrender. The world tilted. She folded the paper into perfect, precise squares and placed it under her mattress like a ritual. Then she sat very still, because moving might make the grief real. That night, the mess hall felt obscene. The food was generous, as always meat. Potatoes, butter, peaches, but the smell of it made her sick. When Jimmy Mueller, the kindly mess sergeant, offered her a tray, she shook her head. He frowned. You need to eat something. Miss, please. Greta stared at the plate. All she could see were ashes. When she didn't eat again the next day or the one after, Liselle noticed. Of course she did. You've stopped eating, Liselle said quietly that evening, standing over her bunk. Her voice wasn't sympathetic, it was sharp, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. About time you saw the truth. Greta didn't answer. They fed us, Liselle continued, voice rising, while our families starved. They fattened us while Germany burned. They wanted us to forget who we are. I didn't forget, Greta whispered. You befriended her. Liselle spat. That Japanese woman. You learned their words. Laughed at their piano. Took their kindness. You're no better than they are. Greta's jaw tightened. What am I supposed to do? Hate them for feeding me? Yes, Liselle shouted. Hate them for making you weak. For making you love your enemy. The words hit a nerve so raw that something inside Greta broke. She rose. Fists clenched. You call this weakness. You want honor. My family is dead. My grandmother hanged herself for a lie. Liselle's face twisted, triumphant and furious all at once, because she knew what honor meant. You disgrace her memory. That did it. Greta lunged. The two women crashed into the bunk. Fists, hair, screams, and years of repression exploding in a blur of motion. Anna and two others tried to separate them. But Greta was past reason. She wanted to hurt something, anything, to bleed out the guilt that had no other exit. Guards burst in, dragging them apart. Greta's jaw throbbed where Liselle's fist had landed. Her knuckles split and bleeding. She was still screaming when they threw her into isolation. The cell was small, concrete walls. A cot, a bucket, nothing else. The door clanged shut, sealing her into a silence that roared louder than any battlefield. At first, she raged. She shouted at the walls until her throat gave out, kicked the cot until her toes bled. But eventually the exhaustion came, and she folded into herself, knees to chest, breathing in dust and regret. She thought of the films, of Sarah Tanaka's calm voice saying, "Restraint isn't kindness." She thought of her family dying while she slept on a mattress. She thought of steak, and she wondered, was gratitude the same as betrayal? On the third day, footsteps echoed outside. The slot in the door clanked open. I got the report about your family, Sarah said softly. I'm sorry. Greta didn't move. You didn't kill them. Her voice was barely audible. No, Sarah said. And neither did you. Greta let out a bitter laugh. Didn't I? I wore the uniform. I sent the codes. I believed the lies. You are 22, Sarah replied. You followed orders because that's what your country taught you to do. You didn't drop the bombs. Greta, you didn't build the camps. I should have been there. Greta whispered. I should have died with them. It would have been honest. Sarah's reply was steady, almost clinical. Would it have changed anything? Silence. Then, softer. You didn't choose to be captured. You didn't choose to be fed. But you can choose what to do with surviving. Greta looked up for the first time. The lieutenant stood outside the bars, hands clasped behind her back. She wasn't the stern officer now, just a woman with dark, tired eyes. People are going to need bridges, Sarah continued. Between languages, between enemies, between what was and what's coming. You can be one of them, or you can let guilt eat you alive. But either way, your family is still gone. And you're still here. Her boots scraped against the concrete as she turned to leave. The sound faded down the corridor. For a long moment, Greta sat in the quiet, staring at the place where Sarah had stood. Then the tears came, not the quiet, shameful ones she'd hidden before, but raw, racking sobs that tore through her chest. She cried until she couldn't breathe, until there was nothing left but the fact of her own heartbeat. By the time the guards opened the cell door 2 days later, something inside her had changed. Not healed, just changed. She walked back to the barracks with her hands still shaking, but her steps steady. The desert air smelled of sagebrush and sun-warmed dust. For the first time, she realized it wasn't the smell of prison. It was the smell of survival. When Greta emerged from isolation, the camp was already shifting toward its end. The war in Europe was over, and the Pacific would soon follow. Soldiers packed records into crates. Fences were mended for the last inspections, and rumors spread like wildfire. Repatriation was coming. The prisoners would be sent home to what was left of it. Home? The word meant less than it used to. For Greta, there was no home left, only ruins and ghosts. Still, the rhythms of camp life resumed. Work details, mail call, the faint echo of laughter at dusk. Yet beneath that fragile routine, something new was growing a purpose. It began with an envelope. One afternoon, Lieutenant Tanaka approached Greta in the laundry yard. Her tone was brisk, almost businesslike, but her eyes were softer. She handed Greta a letter written in wavering German script. Red Cross needs a translator. Tanaka said, "This came from a refugee in Tucson, a mother searching for her daughter lost between Munich and the Swiss border. I told them you might help." Greta stared at the paper. Her English was still clumsy, her German suddenly foreign on her tongue. But she nodded. That night, under the barracks lamp, she began to translate. Each sentence was like threading 2 broken languages through the same needle. My daughter, Lotte, age 16, scar on left hand from kitchen accident. Greta paused at that line. The detail, a scar, small, human. Proof of life made her throat tighten. She translated slowly, carefully, adding notes about where to search, which agencies to contact, how to verify Red Cross files. When she finished, she felt something unfamiliar. Not pride, exactly, but usefulness. For months she had felt like a hollow vessel fed, clothed, alive by accident. Now, for the first time, her survival seemed to mean something. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. Then another. Word had spread that there was a German woman at Camp Florence who could write English, someone who could help bridge the bureaucratic chasm between destroyed Europe and the safe, distant world of America. Greta became the camp's unofficial translator, crafting replies for mothers, widows, soldiers' wives, anyone desperate to find a missing name in the chaos. Each translation was a lifeline thrown across oceans of grief. And with every letter, Greta felt herself inch closer to something resembling purpose. Then one morning, Lieutenant Tanaka brought her a reply from the Tucson mother. Greta read it 3 times. Unable to breathe. They had found the daughter, alive, in a displaced persons camp near Stuttgart. The letter ended simply. Please thank whoever helped me. Tell her she gave me back my reason to live. Greta pressed the paper to her chest. For months, she had believed survival was shame. But in that moment, she understood it could also be redemption. Not the grand kind. Not the kind nations wrote about in history books. But the quiet kind that rebuilt a single broken line between mother and child. The Red Cross soon began visiting Camp Florence more frequently, preparing for the final phase of prisoner release. A tall woman with a crisp uniform and kind eyes gathered the inmates in the recreation hall one evening. We're looking for German speakers, she said in careful German. to help with displaced persons operations in Europe. It's difficult work, long hours, endless for stories that will haunt you. But it's where rebuilding begins. A murmur ran through the room. Some women looked away. Others wept quietly. Liesel, arms folded, sneered. They want to make us servants now, she muttered. Traitors helping the enemy's cause. But Greta wasn't listening. She was watching Tanaka. The lieutenant stood at the back, expression unreadable. When their eyes met, Tanaka gave a small, deliberate nod. That night, Greta opened the old English-German dictionary. Her fingers traced the word she'd found weeks earlier, purpose. She whispered it under her breath, tasting the shape of it. When the Red Cross representative called for volunteers the next morning, Greta raised her hand. Liesel glared. You're still choosing them, she said. Greta shook her head. No, I'm choosing the people who need help. That includes us. Liesel turned away, muttering something about honor and shame. But Greta didn't argue. For once, she didn't need to. As repatriation day approached, the camp filled with conflicting emotions: relief, dread, and a strange nostalgia. Many of the women were terrified to leave. They'd read reports of a starving Germany carved into occupation zones, of chaos and retribution. Anna clutched a photograph of her family's old home. Now, rubble. At least here we're human, she whispered. At least here we have beds. Even Liesel, so defiant before, stood by the window at night and admitted softly, maybe we should have stayed prisoners. It's the only safe place left. Greta understood. The camp had become a paradox, a cage that offered order when the world outside dissolved into ruin. The day before departure, the Red Cross distributed forms for the prisoners to sign statements about their treatment at Camp Florence. Greta sat at a wooden table, pen poised above the blank line. She thought about everything she'd seen. The steak dinner, the dictionary, the newsreel, the cell, the letter. Slowly, she wrote. I came expecting cruelty. I was given law. I expected savagery. I was given restraint. I do not yet understand mercy, but I have witnessed it. I will spend my life learning how to pass it forward. When she handed the page to Lieutenant Tanaka, their eyes met one last time. No speeches, no goodbyes, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed in both of them. Good luck, Tanaka said simply. Greta nodded. She wanted to say more, to thank her, to apologize, to promise, but the words stayed lodged behind her teeth. As the transport truck rolled out of Camp Florence, she looked back once. The fences blurred in the heat, the guard towers dissolving into the endless sky. It struck her that the camp, for all its walls, had been the first place where she'd truly seen freedom. Freedom not as triumph, but as the discipline to act with humanity when vengeance would be easier. Years later, historians would call the American POW system a triumph of law in war. They would note that camps like Florence helped shape the modern Geneva Conventions of 1949, the foundation of humanitarian law that governs armed conflict to this day. But for Greta Hoffman, none of it was theory. It was lived proof that restraint when practiced by flawed, grieving people was civilization's last defense against its own darkness. And in that understanding, somewhere between guilt and purpose, she finally found a way to live. The trucks departed Camp Florence at dawn. The desert stretched endless and golden in the rising light, mirroring the quiet uncertainty inside the prisoners' hearts. Greta Hoffman sat near the back, her hands resting on the wooden bench, her eyes on the receding fences. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of what came next, only unsure. The barbed wire shrank in the distance until it was just a faint shimmer in the heat. Behind those fences, 1,000 stories had ended or begun in silence. For Greta, it was both. She carried with her two possessions: the German-English dictionary, its cover worn, soft as fabric, and a folded letter of thanks from a woman in Tucson who had found her daughter because Greta had translated her plea. Two fragile artifacts of transformation. The desert wind slipped through the open slats of the truck, warm and dry. Greta looked down at her hands that had once carried orders across a radio desk in Germany, then washed enemy uniforms in Arizona, then held a pen to bridge languages. The same hand, 3 lives apart. She thought about Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka, the measured tone, the precise German, the refusal to hate. Greta wondered if Sarah had gone home to California, if her parents had been released from their internment camp, if she'd found peace, or if, like Greta, she was haunted by everything restraint had demanded of her. When the truck crested a hill, the sun broke across the desert in full, brutal splendor. Greta raised a hand to shield her eyes and felt something shift inside her, a recognition, maybe, that guilt and gratitude could coexist, that the two weren't enemies after all, but twin truths that could guide a life. The ship that carried her to Europe was crowded with men and women who looked like ghosts. Soldiers returning home in silence. Former prisoners clutching documents stamped by the Red Cross. Each face told a story of survival that didn't feel like victory. As the shoreline of a ruined continent came into view, Greta caught the faint scent of salt and oil and decay. Cities were dust, rivers clogged with debris, the air thick with the exhaustion of a world trying to remember what peace meant. She reported to a Red Cross office in Stuttgart, one of hundreds springing up amid the wreckage. There, Greta joined a small team of translators tasked with reconnecting lost families, processing displaced persons, and documenting missing soldiers. She worked 12-hour days in a building with shattered windows and a roof patched with canvas. Every letter she translated felt like a resurrection. Every reunion, she witnessed a mother recognizing a child. A brother locating a sister felt like quiet defiance against the chaos. Sometimes, at night, when the generators cut out and the office sank into candlelight, she would open her dictionary and trace the words Tanaka had taught her to pronounce. Restraint, justice, mercy. They weren't abstract terms anymore, they were tools for rebuilding. One evening, while filing reports, Greta came across a Geneva Convention pamphlet issued by the Allied authorities. The year on the cover was 1949. Inside, new articles expanded the protections Tanaka had once recited in the mess hall. Broader rights for civilians. Stricter prohibitions against torture and humiliation. Greta read the opening line 3 times. Even war has limits. She smiled faintly. Sarah had been right. Law wasn't mercy. It was the scaffold that made mercy possible. And without it, civilization collapsed into noise. She signed her name at the bottom of a witness form that day in careful English. Greta Hoffman. Translator. The title felt unreal, but also earned. Decades later, when the world had changed again and new wars erupted on new continents, a journalist from Munich found her. Greta was living quietly in Switzerland, retired but still volunteering part-time with humanitarian archives. The journalist asked her what she remembered most from her captivity. The hunger, the fear, the propaganda. Greta shook her head. No, she said softly. I remember the meal. The meal, yes. The first night at Camp Florence. Beef roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, a roll, peaches. I remember thinking it must be poisoned. The journalist frowned. Why remember that? Because, Greta said, her gaze distant. It was the moment I realized everything I believed about the enemy was a lie. And when you lose a lie, You start to find the truth. She didn't tell him about the letter she translated or the dictionary she still kept in her desk. Some things belong to silence. History books would later summarize Camp Florence in a few lines. A major U.S. POW camp in Arizona that housed Axis prisoners under humane conditions, contributing to the refinement of post-war humanitarian law. But the reports never mentioned the moment a young German woman and a Nisei lieutenant sat across a mess hall table and redefined what mercy looked like. They never mentioned how restraint, enforced by law and practiced by wounded people, became the only thing that kept the world from repeating its worst sins. In her final years, Greta often reread her old Red Cross statement, the one she'd written before leaving Florence. I came expecting cruelty. I was given law. I expected savagery. I was given restraint. I do not yet understand mercy, but I have witnessed it. She had long since come to understand. Mercy was not softness. It was strength bound by discipline. Justice, tempered by empathy. It was the courage to see humanity where the world demanded hatred. And as the Arizona wind still whispered across the ruins of Camp Florence long since dismantled, the sand reclaiming the barracks, its silence seemed to echo the same truth Greta had carried all her life. Civilization doesn't survive through victory. It survives through restraint.